The atmosphere of Krios Nine did not just bite, it sought to erase. A relentless gale screamed across the crystalline flats, driving shards of frozen silicate that could pit even the reinforced carbonite of a starship hull. Jaxen Vane stood in the center of the white chaos, his boots locked into the permafrost. His environment suit hummed a low, steady protest as the internal heaters struggled against the negative 80-degree exterior. Through the amber tint of his polarized visor, the world was a shifting blur of lethal geometry. Then the static flared. It was not a visual thing, but a phantom sensation behind his eyes. In the swirling storm, neon blue lines of raw data began to etch themselves onto his retinas. He saw the heat signatures before he saw the physical forms. A massive biological mass was approaching, moving with a grace that defied the wind. Beside it, or rather atop it, sat a smaller figure radiating a cold, calculated authority that cut through the static like a blade. "Why are you not trembling human?" The voice did not come from the air. It vibrated directly into his auditory nerves through a localized synaptic beam. Jaxen did not flinch. He adjusted the grip on his heavy-bore kinetic rifle, but kept the muzzle pointed at the ice. "One word from me and my pet will devour you." The storm seemed to part as if by command. Emerging from the veil of white was a Vix drake, a creature of nightmare and elegance. It stood 4 meters at the shoulder, its hide composed of interlocking obsidian scales that shimmered with an internal violet light. Its eyes were twin pools of liquid nitrogen, freezing anything they touched with predatory focus. On its back sat a woman who looked like she had been carved from the very aurora that haunted the Krios skies. Her skin was the color of pale lavender, and her hair a shimmering waterfall of liquid silver whipped around a face that was terrifyingly beautiful. Jaxen spat a mouthful of recycled air into his mask. "Fear is a lot of work, Princess. And honestly, I am just too tired for the workout." The woman narrowed her eyes. Her armor was a masterpiece of hegemony engineering, golden filigree pulsing with the rhythmic heartbeat of a miniature fusion core. She looked down at him as if he were a particularly stubborn insect that refused to be crushed by the weight of the universe. "You know who I am," she stated. It was not a question. "High Lady Thalia of the Synaptic Hegemony." Jaxen replied, his voice rasping through the comms. Hard to miss that royal crest. It is practically screaming, "Take a shot at me in 3 different spectrums." Thalia leaned forward, the movement fluid and dangerously feline. "Most of your kind would be begging for a quick death." The Vix Drake let out a low vibration that shook the ice beneath Jaxen's boots. It bared rows of translucent teeth, each one sharpened to a monomolecular edge. Obsidian Gale hasn't tasted fresh marrow in 3 cycles. He is quite keen on the idea of a snack. Jaxen let out a short, dry laugh. "Look, Your Highness, if you wanted me dead, I would be a red smear on the ice 5 minutes ago. You are out here in the middle of a grade 5 screamer, which means you are either looking for something or you are hiding from someone. Since I am the only one for 50 kilometers who knows how to navigate the Shimmer Peaks, I am guessing you need a scout." The princess stiffened. Her silver hair seemed to crackle with static electricity. "Your arrogance is noted human, but you forget the Dominion does not negotiate with strays. We conquer, we integrate, we optimize." "Yeah, I heard the brochure," Jaxen said, shifting his weight. "But the hegemony hasn't optimized this rock yet. If you try to ride that overgrown lizard into the peaks without a static guide, the resonance will fry its brain and yours along with it. You will be flatlined before you hit the first ridge." A silence stretched between them, heavier than the frozen air. The Vix Drake huffed a cloud of crystalline vapor, its gaze never leaving Jaxen's throat. Thalia studied him, her expression unreadable behind her translucent battle mask. For a moment, the only sound was the howl of the wind and the whine of their respective life support systems. "You possess the static mutation," Thalia murmured. The disdain in her voice was tempered by a sliver of genuine curiosity. A defect of the brain turned into a primitive sensory tool. "How quaint." Jaxen shrugged. "Call it what you want. It keeps me breathing, while your fancy mesh would turn me into a vegetable in this interference. So what is it going to be? Do I get devoured or do we go for a walk?" Thalia dismounted the beast in one seamless motion, landing on the ice with the lightness of a snowflake. She walked toward him, her golden armor pulsing brighter with every step. When she was only a few centimeters away, she reached out a gloved hand and tapped the center of his visor. "You are a bold one, Jaxen Vane. or perhaps just exceptionally stupid. But the Inquisitors are right about one thing. Humans have a certain grit that defied logic. She leaned in closer, her scent a strange mixture of ozone and winter lilies. Led the way, human. But know this. If you lead us into a trap, I will ensure your death takes several hundred years to complete. My medical nanites can keep a heart beating long after the soul has begged to depart. Jaxen didn't blink. Understood, Your Highness. Just try to keep up. It would be a damn shame to lose a princess to a little bit of snow. Thalia let out a cold melodic laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Move, human. Before I change my mind and let the Gale have his fun. Jaxen turned his back on her, a move that felt like a gamble with a loaded deck, and began to trek toward the jagged silhouette of the Shimmer Peaks. Behind him, the massive beast fell into step, its heavy claws clicking against the ice. He could feel the weight of Thalia gaze on his shoulders. He was ghosting on the edge of a death sentence, and he knew it. But in the world of Krios Nine, you either played the high stakes or you waited for the cold to claim the pot. As they climbed, the static grew louder in his mind. The blue lines became a tangled web of histories and warnings. The planet was screaming, and for the first time in years, Jaxen felt like he was finally listening. The obsidian fortress did not so much sit on the landscape as it pierced it. It was a monolith of dark glass and integrated circuitry rising from the throat of a dead volcano. As Jaxen led Thalia and her massive mount through the primary airlock, the transition was jarring. The screaming silence of the wasteland was replaced by the low hum of 1,000 servers and the artificial warmth of a controlled climate. The air inside tasted of sterility and filtered oxygen. Jaxen removed his helmet with a hiss of depressurization. He shook out his dark matted hair and took a deep breath of the recycled air. It felt heavy in his lungs like lead. Store your kit over there, human, Thalia commanded. She was already stripping away the outer layers of her battlesuit, revealing a skin-tight bodysuit that shimmered with a lavender luminescence. Her skin seemed to pulse with a faint light of its own, a byproduct of the synaptic enhancements that ran through her veins like liquid silver. Jaxen leaned his rifle against a rack, but kept his sidearm strapped to his thigh. I will keep the hardware if it is all the same to you. I have a habit of staying attached to things that keep me alive. Thalia turned, her silver eyes flashing with a spark of amusement. You think a kinetic pistol will save you here? This is a hegemony stronghold. Every wall is a weapon. Every shadow is a sensor. Maybe, Jaxen said, walking toward her. But I have spent my whole life being told what I can't do. It has made me a bit of a skeptic when it comes to security. He watched her move. There was a grace to her that was entirely artificial, yet undeniably perfect. The hegemony didn't just train their royals, they sculpted them. Every gesture was optimized for maximum authority and aesthetic impact. She was a living work of art, and she knew it. You are staring, human, she noted, her voice dropping to a smooth purr. Is the sight of a superior being overwhelming your primitive senses? Jaxen gave her a slow, lopsided grin. I have seen better, though I will admit the lighting in here does wonders for your complexion. Thalia barked a laugh, a sound that felt surprisingly human. You are either the bravest man in this sector, or you are missing several vital circuits. I suspect it is both. Their moment of friction was interrupted by the heavy thud of boots on the crystalline floor. A group of 6 soldiers marched into the chamber, their faces hidden behind expressionless silver masks. At their head was a man whose skin was a deep bruised purple, his face scarred by what looked like ritualistic burns. He wore the heavy crimson cloak of an inquisitor. Malachor Jaxen whispered to himself. The static in his head began to whine a high-pitched warning. High Lady Thalia, the inquisitor said, bowing, with a stiffness that suggested he found the gesture offensive. We were beginning to think the storm had claimed you, and yet I see you have returned with a guest. His gaze fell on Jaxen, and the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The soldiers fanned out, their pulse rifles held in a low-ready position. They were professionals. No wasted movement, no hesitation. This is Jaxen Vane, Thalia said, her voice regaining its icy regal edge. He is a local scout. His mutation was necessary to navigate the peaks. An unregistered static, Malachor said, stepping closer. His eyes were milky white, devoid of pupils. He saw through the mesh, not through biological sight. His presence felt like an oily weight on the mind. These creatures are a contagion, Lady Thalia. They are remnants of a failed evolutionary branch. They should be pruned, not utilized. He is under my protection, Inquisitor, Thalia snapped. Her silver hair began to drift upward, as if caught in an invisible current. Are you questioning my judgment? I am questioning the security of the great project, Malachor countered. We are at a critical juncture. The resonance crystal is nearly primed. Bringing an unfiltered human into this facility is a breach of the highest order. Jaxen watched the exchange carefully. He could see the data streams between them, the invisible battle of authority being fought through their synaptic links. Thalia was strong, but Malachor had the weight of the hegemony law behind him. The human stays. Thalia said, her voice echoing with a power that made the soldiers flinch. He has seen the shimmer peaks. He knows the resonance patterns. He is more valuable than a dozen of your drones, Malachor. The Inquisitor narrowed his sightless eyes. Very well, but he will be monitored. If he so much as breathes out of alignment with the mesh, I will personally see to his deconstruction. He turned his gaze to Jaxen. Do you understand, human? You are a ghost in our machine, and ghosts are easily exorcised. Jaxen just stared back, his face a mask of bored indifference. I have been called worse by better men. Just tell me where the coffee is and we can call it even. Malachor snorted in disgust and signaled his men to withdraw. As they marched away, the tension in the room dissipated, but it did not disappear. It simply went underground. You just made a very powerful enemy, Jaxen said quietly once the Inquisitor was out of earshot. Thalia sighed, the silver light of her skin dimming slightly. Malachor has been a thorn in my side since I arrived on Krios. He represents the old guard. They believe in absolute control. They don't understand that the universe is messy, and humans are the messiest part of it, Jaxen added. Thalia looked at him, her expression softening for a fleeting second. Perhaps that is why I find you so interesting, Jaxen Vane. You are a variable I cannot calculate. She stepped closer, her hand ghosting over the sleeve of his environment suit. Come, I will show you to your quarters. We have much to discuss before the resonance ceremony, and I suggest you keep your weapon close. Malachor does not like losing arguments. As they walked through the corridors of dark glass, Jaxen felt the static in his head begin to hum a new tune. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a melody. The planet Krios 9 was talking to him, and it was saying that the fortress he was standing in wasn't a castle. It was a cage, and the princess beside him wasn't the jailer. She was the most valuable prisoner of all. Jaxen looked at the golden patterns on Thalia's back and felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was a reason to care. Well, he thought as they reached a set of massive obsidian doors. This is going to be a hell of a ride. The guest quarters in the obsidian fortress were less of a room and more of a high-tech display case. The walls were composed of a translucent, smoke-colored polymer that pulsed with a rhythmic, bioluminescent glow, mimicking the heartbeat of the station's central core. Jaxen Vane sat on the edge of a levitating sleep surface, his fingers tracing the jagged scar that ran from his collarbone down to his ribs. It was a souvenir from the siege of Valoni, a gift from a hegemony shock trooper who had been more machine than man. He had survived that hell by the skin of his teeth, and here he was, 3 years later, sitting in the belly of the beast, waiting for the other shoe to drop. His internal static was humming at a low frequency, a restless buzz that usually preceded a localized storm. But the external sensors on his suit, which he had refused to take off entirely, showed the weather outside was holding at a steady, freezing calm. The danger wasn't coming from the atmosphere. It was coming from the walls. A soft chime echoed through the room, and the door slid open without a sound. Thalia stepped inside, her lavender skin glowing softly in the dim light. She had changed into a more casual version of her bodysuit, though casual for a hegemony royal still involved enough integrated circuitry to power a small village. She looked tired, the silver light in her eyes flickering, with a fatigue she clearly didn't want to admit. Still awake, human? She asked, her voice losing some of its sharp, imperial edge. Or do your kind require constant vigilance even in the heart of civilization? Civilization is just a fancy word for a place where the predators wear silk instead of fur, Your Highness, Jackson replied, leaning back against the wall. And I have never been much of a sleeper. Too many ghosts in the machinery of my head. Thalia walked over to the viewport, looking out at the jagged peaks of Krios Nine. Malakor's moving against me. I can feel the shift in the mesh. The digital consensus is beginning to sour. They see my interest in this planet and in you as a sign of instability. Jackson stood up, his boots clunking on the polished floor. You are the High Lady. Can't you just pull rank? Tell them to back off or you will have them scrubbed. Thalia turned, a bitter smile touching her lips. The hegemony is not a monarchy of blood, Jackson. It is a monarchy of data. My authority is tied to my synchronization with the collective. If my compatibility scores drop below 85%, the Inquisitors have the legal right to realign me. It is a polite term for a total neural overwrite. Jackson felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. You're saying they'd lobotomize you for being curious? They would see it as a mercy, she whispered, restoring a corrupted file to its original state. Suddenly, the static in Jackson's brain didn't just buzz, it screamed. It was a jagged, high-voltage spike that made his vision blur into a kaleidoscope of neon fractals. He saw the room not as physical space, but as a grid of energy. He saw 3 heat signatures moving through the ventilation shafts above them, fast, silent, and cold. Their synaptic signatures were shielded, but the static saw the hole they left in the background radiation of the room. Get down! Jackson lunged, his body moving with a frantic, unpolished speed that caught Thalia off guard. He tackled her to the floor just as a burst of high-frequency sonic energy shattered the viewport behind them. The smoke-colored polymer didn't break. It disintegrated into a million stinging needles. If they had been standing, their nervous systems would have been liquefied in less than a second. What in the hell was that? Thalia gasped, her lavender skin turning a frantic shade of violet. Assassins, Jackson spat, rolling behind a heavy crystalline desk and dragging her with him. And they aren't using hegemony standard. That was a localized void pulse. Clean, quiet, and absolutely lethal. The ceiling panels hissed open, and 3 figures dropped into the room. They were clad in matte black stealth suits that absorbed all light, making them look like 3-dimensional shadows. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They moved with a synchronized mechanical precision that suggested they were being controlled by a single combat override. They're black holes, Thalia whispered, her voice trembling. Malakor's personal wetwork squad. They're completely off the mesh. Great, Jackson grunted, pulling his kinetic pistol from his thigh holster. I always wanted to see how a shadow handles a 10mm slug. One of the assassins raised a hand, and a blade of shimmering blue plasma ignited from his forearm. He moved with a blur of speed, closing the distance in a heartbeat. Jackson didn't think. He let the static take over. He saw the path of the blade before it swung, a glowing blue arc in his mind's eye. He parried with the reinforced forearm of his suit, the smell of burning ozone filling the air, and fired 2 rounds point blank into the assassin's chest. The slugs hit with a wet thud, but the shadow didn't go down. It didn't even flinch. It just adjusted its stance and prepared for a second strike. Scud-brain machines, Jackson cursed. They've got no pain receptors. We have to take out the command link. I can't see them, Thalia cried, her fingers clutching at her temples. They are invisible to my sensors. I'm blind, Jackson. This was the moment. The fear hit him like a physical blow, the raw animal terror of being outmatched and outgunned by something that didn't feel. He could run. He knew the maintenance hatches better than anyone. He could disappear into the vents and let them have her. It was the smart move. It was the survivor's move. But then he looked at Thalia. She was a goddess of the stars, a woman who could command entire fleets, and right now, she looked like a scared child lost in a blackout. She was vulnerable, and for some reason, that mattered more to him than his own skin. Courage isn't the absence of the shivers, he reminded himself, gripping his gun until his knuckles turned white. It's moving when your legs want to turn to jelly. Close your eyes, Thalia, Jackson shouted. Don't try to use your mesh. Trust the static. Mashuan. He reached out and grabbed her hand, and for the first time he opened the floodgates of his mutation. He didn't just sense the data, He projected it. He channeled the chaotic, raw energy of the static through their joined hands, bypassing her synaptic filters and slamming the raw imagery of the room directly into her mind. Thalia gasped, her body arching as the unfiltered reality of the combat flared in her brain. She saw the room in shades of ghost blue and electric white. She saw the three shadows as flickering glitches in the world. "Now!" Jaxen yelled. Thalia didn't hesitate. She stood up, her lavender skin erupting in a blinding flare of bioelectric energy. She didn't need a weapon. She was the weapon. She unleashed a focused pulse of synaptic feedback, a wave of pure, unadulterated thought that acted like an EMP for biological brains. The three assassins froze in mid-motion, their command links shattered by the sheer force of her will. They didn't fall. They simply stopped, their bodies becoming nothing more than empty husks of meat and circuitry. Jaxen collapsed against the desk, his head throbbing as if someone were driving a railroad spike into his skull. Projecting the static had taken a heavy toll, burning through his neural pathways like acid. Are you okay?" he wheezed, his vision slowly returning to normal. Thalia was standing in the center of the room, her silver hair shimmering with residual sparks. She looked down at her hands, then at the three frozen shadows. She turned to Jaxen, and for the first time the Imperial mask was completely gone. There was awe in her eyes and something that looked dangerously like gratitude. "You shared it with me," she whispered. "The static. It wasn't just data, Jaxen. It was alive. I felt the planet. I felt the cold. I felt you." Jaxen wiped a smudge of blood from under his nose. "Yeah, well, don't get used to it. It's a hell of a headache." "And I think we just officially checked out of the hotel. Malachor isn't going to stop at one try." Thalia walked over to him and knelt on the floor, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You saved my life. You could have left me to the black holes, but you stayed. Why human? Why risk a total brain fry for a woman who threatened to feed you to her pet?" Jaxen looked at her, his dark eyes tired but steady. "Maybe I just didn't like the odds. Or maybe I'm just tired of people getting realigned because they don't fit the script. Besides," he added with a weak grin, "it's like I told you, I don't scare easy." Thalia didn't smile, but she didn't pull her hand away. "We need to leave the main levels. Malachor controls the security mesh here. There is one place he cannot easily watch, the lower habitats where the Vix drakes are kept. The biological interference there is too thick for his sensors." "The lizard's den?" Jaxen grunted, forcing himself to stand. "Great. Out of the frying pan and into the dragon's mouth. Lead the way, princess. But if that beast tries to nibble on me, I'm holding you responsible." As they slipped out of the room and into the darkened service corridors, Jaxen felt a new kind of static beginning to form. It wasn't a warning of danger, but a resonance of connection. He had shown her his deepest secret, his greatest defect, and she hadn't looked away. She had leaned into it. The fear was still there, lurking in the shadows of the fortress. But as they moved through the darkness together, it felt a little less like a death sentence and a little more like a challenge. And if there was one thing Jaxen Vane knew how to do, it was survive a challenge. The lower habitats of the obsidian fortress felt less like a space station and more like a subterranean jungle. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, musk, and the sharp, metallic tang of Vix drake pheromones. Massive, bioluminescent ferns hung from the ceiling, their fronds dripping with condensed moisture that pitter-pattered onto the mossy floor. The temperature here was kept at a balmy 24 degrees Celsius, a stark contrast to the frozen hell of the surface. In the center of the massive enclosure, Obsidian Gale lay sprawled across a bed of heated obsidian sand. The beast was even more imposing in the low light, its scales shimmering like oil on water. As Jaxen and Thalia approached, the creature's head snapped up, its nitrogen blue eyes fixing on them with an intensity that made Jackson's hand drift toward his pistol. "Easy, Gale," Thalia murmured, her voice vibrating with a specific frequency that seemed to calm the beast instantly. "He is with me. He is a friend." The Vix drake let out a low, rumbling chuff and laid its head back down, though its eyes remained half open, tracking Jackson's every move. "He doesn't look much like a pet right now," Jaxen whispered, keeping a respectful 3 meters of distance. "He looks like a tank with a bad attitude." He is not a pet, Thalia said, her voice carrying a strange, melancholic weight. He is a legacy. My people found the Vix drakes on a dying world 300 years ago. We thought they were just apex predators, but we were wrong. They were the architects of their world's history. Jaxen frowned, his static beginning to hum as he looked at the beast. What do you mean, architects? They don't exactly have opposable thumbs for building monuments. They don't build with stone, Jaxen. They build with neurons. Thalia walked over to the drake and rested her forehead against its massive snout. The hegemony prizes data above all else, but data can be deleted. It can be corrupted. So the ancient ones who preceded the synaptic mesh found a way to store their collective knowledge in a biological medium. They engineered the Vix drakes to be living archives. Jaxen stepped closer, his mutation flaring. He didn't see the scales or the teeth anymore. He saw a dense, incredibly complex network of biosynapses pulsing beneath the skin. It was a massive, organic hard drive holding millions of petabytes of information. Every drake carries a different chapter of the past, Thalia continued. Obsidian Gale holds the records of the pre-cortex era, the time before we all became nodes in the collective. He holds the memories of what it felt like to be individual. Jaxen felt a jolt of realization that hit him harder than a pulse blast. That's why Malachor wants this world. It's not about the crystals or the minerals. It's about the drakes. He wants to wipe them out, or reformat them, Thalia whispered. If he can tap into their neural architecture, he can integrate their individuality into the mesh, effectively neutralizing it. He wants to turn the last records of our freedom into a tool for our absolute subjugation. The static in Jaxen's head began to swirl into a vortex of images. He saw the history of the hegemony not as a glorious march of progress, but as a slow, deliberate erasure of the self. He saw the beauty of the drakes and the tragedy of their purpose. They were the last witnesses to a truth that the universe had forgotten. "Why are you telling me this?" Jaxen asked, his voice rough. "This is ghost code, Thalia. This is the kind of secret that gets people KIA before they can even blink. Because I cannot access it alone," she said, turning to face him. Her silver eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. "My synaptic link is too perfect. It's designed to filter out anything that doesn't align with the collective's truth. When I try to connect with Gale, all I get is white noise. But your static is unfiltered. You see the gaps. You see the broken things." "You want me to hack into a 5-ton lizard?" Jaxen asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "That's not just dangerous, it's suicide. If his brain rejects my static, we both flatline in 5 seconds." "I know," Thalia said, her voice steady despite her fear. "But if we don't do this, the truth dies with him. Malachor's fleet will be here in less than 12 hours. Once the resonance crystal is primed, he will use it to broadcast a purge signal through the habitats. Gale will be lobotomized, and the hegemony will become a prison from which there is no escape." Jaxen looked at the beast, then at the woman standing before him. He saw the fear in her, a deep, existential terror of losing her soul to the machine, and he saw the courage it took for her to ask for help from a primitive like him. He thought about his own life, the years spent running, the years spent hiding from the ghosts of his past. He had always been a survivor, always looked out for number one. But survival without meaning was just a slow way to die. "I'm a scud-brained idiot," Jaxen muttered, stepping up to the beast. "I really am." He reached out his hand, his fingers trembling, and placed them on the obsidian scales of the drake's neck. The creature didn't move, but Jaxen could feel the heat of its blood, the vibration of its massive heart. "What do I do?" he asked. "Close your eyes," Thalia whispered, placing her hand over his. "Don't try to control it. Just listen to the static. Let it find the frequency of the beast." Jaxen did as he was told. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. At first, there was only the familiar buzz, the jagged noise of his mutation. But then, as he focused on the warmth of Thalia's hand and the steady rhythm of the drake's breathing, the noise began to change. It smoothed out into a deep, resonant hum, a sound like 1,000 voices singing in a language he didn't know but somehow understood. It was the sound of history. It was the sound of billions of lives, of love and loss, of war and peace, all woven into a single biological tapestry. He felt himself being pulled into the Drake's mind. He wasn't Jaxen Vane anymore. He was a witness. He saw a sky filled with golden stars, a world where people spoke with their mouths instead of their minds. He felt the raw, unfiltered rush of emotion, the sting of a cold wind, the warmth of a fire, the ache of a broken heart. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was human. Suddenly, a jagged red line of interference tore through the vision. It was cold, sharp, and mathematical. It was the mesh. Malachor was already here. "He's in the system," Jaxen gasped, his body jerking as if he'd been hit by a live wire. "He's trying to overwrite the archive." "Hold on, Jaxen!" Thalia's voice sounded like it was coming from miles away. "Don't let go. If you break the connection now, the feedback will kill Gale." Jaxen gritted his teeth, the static in his head turning into a searing fire. He felt Malachor's presence like a cold hand wrapping around his brain, trying to squeeze the life out of him. The Inquisitor was using the station's main processors to flood the Drake's mind with garbage data, trying to drown the history in a sea of noise. "You won't have him," Jaxen snarled, his voice a low growl. He didn't fight Malachor with logic or data. He fought him with the only thing the Inquisitor couldn't understand. He fought him with the static. He pushed the raw, chaotic energy of his mutation into the Drake's mind, creating a shield of pure noise around the archive. It was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a handful of sand. But for a moment, the red line of interference faltered. "Thalia! Now!" Thalia didn't need to be told twice. She channeled her own bioelectric energy into the link, but this time, she didn't use it to attack. She used it to stabilize Jaxen. She became the anchor, her perfect synaptic link providing the structure that his static lacked. Together, they formed a bridge between the machine and the beast. They were two different species, two different worlds, joined by a single, desperate goal. The archive flared with a brilliant silver light. For a heartbeat, the entire habitat was bathed in the radiance of the past. The noise of Malachor's intrusion was silenced, pushed back by the sheer weight of a billion memories. And then it was over. Jaxen collapsed onto the obsidian sand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Obsidian Gale let out a long, low moan, his eyes glowing with a renewed clarity. The beast looked at Jaxen, and for a second the scout felt a profound sense of gratitude emanating from the creature. It was a wordless thank you that vibrated through the marrow of his bones. Thalia slumped beside him, her skin pale and her silver hair matted with sweat. She looked at Jaxen, her eyes wide with shock. "We did it," she whispered. "The archive is safe. He couldn't overwrite it." Jaxen tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He just nodded, his hand still resting on the Drake's scales. He felt a strange sense of peace, a quietness in his head that he hadn't felt in years. The static was still there, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a part of him. "Malachor will know," Jaxen finally managed to say. "He felt us in there. He's going to bring everything he's got to this habitat." "I know," Thalia said, her voice hardening, "but we have something he doesn't have now. We have the truth, and we have each other." She looked at him, and Jaxen saw the change in her. She wasn't just a high lady anymore. She was a rebel. She had chosen a side, and it wasn't the side of the hegemony. "What's the plan, Princess?" Jaxen asked, forcing himself to sit up. "Because I don't think we can hide in the lizard den forever." "We go to the larynx," Thalia said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous resolve. "The main transmission tower at the peak of the volcano. If we can broadcast the archive's data through the resonance crystal before Malachor purges it, we can wake up the entire sector. We can show them what they've lost." "A suicide mission to the highest point on the planet during a grade 5 storm?" Jaxen gave her a tired, lopsided grin. "Now that sounds like my kind of party." As they prepared to move, Jaxen checked his pistol and adjusted his suit's seals. He was terrified. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, to hide, to find a ship and get as far away from Krios Nine as possible. But as he looked at Thalia and the massive, ancient beast beside her, he knew he wasn't going anywhere. Courage wasn't about not feeling the shivers. It was about standing your ground when the whole world was trying to knock you down. "One more thing." Jaxen said, stopping Thalia before they left the habitat. If we don't make it, thanks for not feeding me to the lizard. Thalia reached out and squeezed his hand, her touch warm and surprisingly firm. The lizard likes you, Jaxen Vane. And so do I. Now let's go start a revolution. The two of them slipped out of the habitat, moving like ghosts through the shadows of the fortress. Behind them, Obsidian Gale stood up, his obsidian scales shimmering in the dark. He was no longer just an archive. He was a guardian. And the fire in his eyes promised that the past would not be forgotten without a fight. The climb to the larynx would be long, cold, and filled with blood. But as Jaxen led the way through the darkened maintenance shafts, he felt the static in his head begin to sing. It was the song of the future, and for the first time in his life, he was eager to hear how it ended. He had spent his whole life being afraid of his own mind, afraid of the world, afraid of the people who wanted to control him. But standing there in the dark, with a silver-haired princess and a prehistoric dragon at his back, Jaxen Vane realized that he had never been more alive. The fear was still there, a cold weight in his stomach, but he welcomed it, because he knew that as long as he was afraid, he was still human. And as long as he was human, he still had a chance to win. "Move it, human!" Thalia's voice came through the comms, soft but filled with a hidden strength. "The stars are waiting." I'm moving, Jaxen whispered back, a grin spreading across his face. "Just don't trip over your own destiny, Your Highness. It's a long way down." They vanished into the depths of the volcano, two small specks of light against the encroaching darkness of the synaptic hegemony. The battle for Krios Nine had only just begun, but the outcome was no longer a foregone conclusion. The variable had been introduced, the static had been released, and the universe would never be the same again. Jaxen felt the wind howling through the vents, a distant echo of the storm outside. He took a deep breath of the metallic air and pushed forward. He wasn't trembling. He was ready. As they emerged from the lower levels and began the arduous ascent toward the summit, the internal map in Jaxen's mind flared to life. Every kilometer of the climb was etched in his brain, every sensor array and patrol route highlighted by the static. They had 3,000 meters of vertical ascent ahead of them, and Malakor's forces were likely already converging on the larynx. Time to see if those Pathfinder drills were worth the sweat, Jaxen muttered to himself. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed, the insulation of the lower levels giving way to the raw, unshielded rock of the volcano's interior. Thalia moved with a surprising resilience, her synaptic enhancements compensating for the physical strain, but Jaxen could see the toll it was taking on her. Her lavender skin was pale, and her breathing was shallow. "We have to keep going," she panted, leaning against a jagged outcrop of obsidian. "We're not stopping," Jaxen said, his voice firm. "We're 200 meters from the secondary airlock. Once we're inside the larynx, we'll have the high ground." He reached out and took her hand again, not for the static this time, but for the simple human need for connection. Thalia gripped his hand back, her fingers cold but steady. They weren't just a scout and a princess anymore. They were two survivors, pushing through the dark toward a light they both hoped was still there. The fear was their constant companion, a shadow that walked beside them every step of the way. But as they crested the final ridge and saw the shimmering, crystalline spire of the larynx rising into the storm-tossed sky, Jaxen knew they had already won the most important battle. They had chosen to act. And in a universe governed by absolute logic and cold data, that choice was the most powerful thing of all. The maintenance shafts of the Obsidian Fortress were a claustrophobic nightmare of throbbing conduits and hissing steam. Jaxen Vane led the way, his body twisted into a low crouch as he navigated the labyrinthine network of pipes that served as the station's circulatory system. Behind him, Thalia moved with a frantic, uncoordinated grace. Without the constant stabilizing feedback of the synaptic mesh, her balance was off, her movements jerky and uncertain. To her, the world was no longer a structured grid of data. It was a sensory assault of shadows, noise, and raw, unfiltered physical sensation. "Keep your head down, princess," Jaxen whispered, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic thumping of the massive coolant pumps. "We're coming up on the primary junction for the mid-level sectors. Malakor's roaches will be crawling all over the main hubs. We need to bug out through the thermal vents before they lock down the entire grid." Thalia stumbled, her hand catching on a jagged heat shield. She let out a sharp gasp of pain, staring at the thin line of crimson blood welling on her lavender palm. To an ordinary human, it was a minor scratch. To a high lady of the hegemony, it was a terrifying anomaly. In her world, medical nanites closed wounds before the brain could even register the trauma. It, it hurts, Jaxen, she breathed, her silver eyes wide with shock. The sensation. It's so sharp. It's like the air is biting me. Jaxen stopped and turned, looking at her with a mixture of pity and grim resolve. He reached out and took her hand, his rough, calloused thumb brushing over the cut. That's called being alive, Thalia. It's messy, it's painful, and it doesn't have a reset button. Welcome to the club. How do you stand it? She asked, her voice trembling. How do you function when everything is so loud, so unpredictable? You don't stand it. You use it, Jaxen said, pulling a small roll of medical tape from his vest and quickly binding the wound. Fear, pain, exhaustion, they're just indicators. They tell you where the edges are. In the hegemony, you guys have spent so long smoothing out the edges that you've forgotten how to climb. Now move, we've got company. The static in Jaxen's head suddenly flared into a high-pitched whine. It wasn't the deep resonance of the drakes this time. It was the artificial, jagged pulse of hegemony seeker drones. He looked up at the ceiling, his vision flickering into the ghost blue spectrum. 4 thermal signatures were moving rapidly through the parallel shaft, their cooling fans whirring like angry hornets. Dusting, Jaxen cursed, pulling Thalia into a narrow alcove behind a massive power transformer. The Inquisitors dropped the heavy hitters. Those are Mark IV seekers. They don't just scan for life signs, they scan for neural anomalies. They're looking for my static. Can we fight them? Thalia whispered, her hand tightening around Jaxen's arm. In this tin can, not a chance. Their pulse cannons would turn this whole shaft into an oven, Jaxen said, his mind racing. We need to scramble their sensors. Give me your hand again. Thalia hesitated. The last time they had shared the static, it had nearly liquefied her brain. But she looked at the shadows of the drones flickering through the grate above them and nodded. Jaxen closed his eyes and reached deep into the well of his mutation. Instead of projecting a clear image this time, he did the opposite. He gathered all the chaotic, entropic noise of Krios Nine, the screaming wind, the grinding ice, the ancient, restless echoes of the drakes, and funneled it into a single, concentrated burst of neural trash. It was the digital equivalent of throwing a handful of sand into a high-speed engine. The seeker drones overhead let out a series of confused chirps. Their flight patterns became erratic, one of them slamming into the side of the shaft with a shower of sparks. The static was a blinding, white noise fog that their logic circuits couldn't penetrate. Go! Now! Jaxen urged, shoving Thalia toward a heavy circular hatch at the end of the junction. They scrambled through the opening just as the drones regained their orientation and unleashed a blind volley of pulse fire. The heat of the blast singed the air behind them, melting the polymer floor into a bubbling sludge. Jaxen slammed the hatch shut and engaged the manual deadbolts, cutting off the pursuit. They were in a vertical transit tube, a shaft that dropped 3,000 meters into the heart of the volcano. A series of narrow maintenance ladders lined the walls, disappearing into a darkness so thick it felt tangible. We have to climb, Jaxen said, his breath coming in heavy, ragged clouds. The larynx is directly above this vent. It's the only way to bypass the main security gates. Thalia looked up into the abyss, her face pale. I can't. My physical synchronization is failing. My muscles feel like they are made of lead. Your muscles are fine, princess. It's your head that's the problem, Jaxen said, stepping close to her. He didn't use the static this time. He just looked her in the eye, man to woman. You've spent your whole life being carried by a machine. Now the machine is gone, and you're terrified because you have to rely on yourself. You think you're weak, but you're not. You're just new. He grabbed the rungs of the ladder and began to ascend, his movements methodical and practiced. Courage isn't about feeling strong, Thalia. It's about being terrified and taking the next step anyway. Now get on the ladder, unless you want to wait here for Malachor to turn you into a file save. Thalia stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then with a shuddering breath, she reached out and gripped the cold metal rungs. Her first few steps were clumsy, her hands shaking so hard she nearly lost her grip. But as she climbed, something changed. The rhythm of the movement, the physical reality of the strain, began to ground her. She wasn't a high lady anymore. She was a living being fighting for every meter. They climbed for what felt like hours, the only sound the clink of metal and the distant, rhythmic thrumming of the volcano. The air grew thinner and colder as they rose, the smell of sulfur and ozone becoming more intense. Finally, they reached a secondary platform, a narrow metal grating that hung over the abyss. Jaxen pulled Thalia up beside him, both of them collapsing against the cold stone wall of the shaft. We're almost there, Jaxen panted, checking his suit's internal clock. It's been 6 hours since we left the habitat. Malakor's fleet should be entering high orbit any minute now. Thalia sat up, her lavender skin streaked with grease and sweat. She looked at her hands, bruised, blackened, and trembling, and then she looked at Jaxen. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. I did it, she whispered. I climbed 300 meters without a single neural assist. I felt every rung, every ache. Told you, Jaxen grunted, though his eyes held a glimmer of genuine pride. You're getting the hang of this human thing. It's mostly just suffering and stubbornness. Their moment of respite was cut short by a sound that made the entire mountain tremble. It wasn't the volcano. It was a deep, resonating hum that vibrated in the very marrow of Jaxen's bones. The resonance crystal. Jaxen's static went into a frenzy, his vision exploding into a white-hot glare. He saw the fortress above them, lighting up like a supernova on the data spectrum. Malakor had begun the priming sequence. He's early, Thalia cried, her eyes wide with alarm. He's bypassing the final safety protocols. He's going to force the broadcast before the crystal is stable. That'll shatter the spire, Jaxen said, pushing himself to his feet. If that crystal goes critical, it won't just purge the drakes, it'll level this whole hemisphere. He doesn't care, Thalia said, her voice filled with a cold, terrifying clarity. To Malakor, a dead world is better than an uncontrolled one. He would rather rule over ashes than share a reality with something he cannot predict. Jaxen checked his pistol, his jaw set in a hard line. Then we better go stop him. I've never been a fan of ashes. They moved toward the final access hatch, the air around them beginning to shimmer with the buildup of raw, psychic energy. The larynx was screaming, a high-frequency wail that only Jaxen and Thalia could hear. It was the sound of a planet being prepared for its own execution. As they reached the hatch, Jaxen stopped and looked at Thalia. Listen, once we're inside the larynx, it's going to be a bloodbath. Malakor will have his elite guard there. I can handle the shooting, but you have to be the one to broadcast the archive. You're the only one who knows the resonance frequency. Thalia nodded, her silver hair whipping around her face as the vent began to draw in the freezing air from the summit. I know, but Jaxen, if I connect to the crystal while it's in this state, there's no guarantee I can come back. The feedback could erase me just as easily as it could save the drakes. Jaxen reached out and rested his hand on her cheek. His touch was light, almost hesitant. Then don't go back to the mesh. Stay with the archive. Stay with the static. Just don't let him take you, Thalia. She leaned into his touch for a fleeting second, a gesture of profound vulnerability. I'm afraid, Jaxen. Good, he said, his voice soft but unwavering. That means you're ready. He slammed his fist against the manual release, and the hatch hissed open. They were met with a wall of blinding light and a roar of wind that sounded like the end of the world. The larynx awaited, and so did the Inquisitor. The interior of the larynx was a cathedral of light and terror. A massive crystalline spire, 50 meters in height, rose from the center of the chamber, pulsing with a violent, rhythmic violet energy. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the static hum of a trillion data bits being forced through a narrow aperture. Around the base of the spire, a dozen technicians worked at glowing consoles, their faces illuminated by the frantic, shifting patterns of the resonance matrix. Standing on a raised platform overlooking the crystal was Malakor. He looked like a dark god of the machine, his crimson cloak billowing in the artificial gale. He held a control rod in his hand, his milky white eyes fixed on the spire with a terrifying, singular focus. The broadcast begins in 10 minutes, Malakor's voice boomed, amplified by the station's internal comms. The chaos of this world will be silenced. The anomaly of the Drakes will be purged. Krios 9 will finally be optimized. Jaxen and Thalia emerged from the maintenance hatch behind a cluster of massive power conduits. They were 200 meters from the central platform, but between them and Malachor stood a squad of hegemony centurions, elite warriors clad in heavy, graviton-reinforced armor. Scud-brained roaches, Jaxen hissed, checking the charge on his kinetic rifle. They've got the high ground and the heavy gear. This is going to be messy. I need to get to the primary interface, Thalia whispered, her eyes fixed on a console directly beneath the spire. If I can insert the archive key there, I can override the broadcast. But the Centurions will cut me down before I even reach the first tier. Jaxen looked at the squad of armored giants, then at the woman beside him. The fear was a cold weight in his chest, a heavy reminder of all the times he had seen men better than him die for less. He thought about the Drakes, about Obsidian Gale, and about the billion lives stored in the beast mind. He thought about Thalia and the way she had climbed the ladder when her body wanted to give up. I'll buy you the time, Jaxen said, his voice flat and determined. I'll draw their fire. You run for that console. Don't stop for anything, you hear me? Not for me, not for the noise, just run. Jaxen, you can't take on an entire squad of Centurions, Thalia said, her voice filled with a desperate concern. They are optimized for zero-error combat. They will kill you in seconds. Maybe, Jaxen said, a grim smile touching his lips. But they're optimized for fighting things that make sense. They aren't ready for a static head with nothing to lose. He didn't wait for her to argue. He stood up and unleashed a continuous stream of kinetic fire into the nearest power conduit, the explosion showering the Centurions in a cascade of sparks and superheated coolant. Hey, roaches! Jaxen roared, stepping out from behind the conduits. I hear your Inquisitor is looking for a new file save. Why don't you come and see if you can catch a ghost? The Centurions turned as one, their pulse rifles tracking his heat signature with mechanical precision. But Jaxen was already moving, his static flaring into a blinding aura of neural noise. He didn't run in a straight line. He moved in a series of jagged, entropic zigzags that defied their targeting algorithms. He was a glitch in their reality, a phantom that flickered between the pulses of their fire. Now, Thalia, go! Thalia didn't hesitate. She broke from the shadows, her lavender bodysuit a streak of light against the dark stone. She ran with a desperate, uncoordinated speed, her feet slipping on the mossy floor, her lungs burning with the thin, metallic air. She didn't look at the Centurions. She didn't look at Jaxen. She kept her eyes fixed on the console, the memory of Obsidian Gale's gratitude a steady hum in her mind. Jaxen dived behind a stack of storage crates, his armor smoking from a dozen glancing pulse hits. He popped up and fired a volley of slugs into the lead Centurion's visor, the heavy kinetic rounds shattering the reinforced glass and sending the giant staggering back. Come on, you gearheads, Jaxen yelled, his voice cracking with the strain of the static. Is that the best the hegemony can do? I've seen better shooting from a drunk miner on a Sunday. He was a whirlwind of motion and noise, a one-man army of chaos. He used every trick he had learned in 20 years of scavenging and soldiering. He rigged a cluster of thermal grenades to a coolant line, creating a localized fog that blinded their sensors. He used his static to scramble their comms, filling their ears with the screaming voice of Krios Nine. But the cost was high. Jaxen's vision was blurring, his nose bleeding from the sheer neural pressure of the mutation. Every time he pushed the static, it felt like a hot iron was being pressed into his brain. He was burning out, his nervous system fraying under the load. One of the Centurions bypassed the fog and slammed a heavy armored fist into Jaxen's ribs. He felt the bones snap, the air leaving his lungs in a sickening wheeze. He fell to the floor, the world spinning in a nauseating whirl of violet and gold. You can't have us, he gasped, trying to raise his pistol. The Centurion raised its rifle, the barrel glowing with a lethal charge. Jaxen looked up at the weapon and felt a strange, detached sense of peace. He had done his job. He had bought her the time. But the killing blow never came. A massive shadow fell over the platform, a roar of primal fury drowning out the hum of the crystal. Obsidian Gale crashed through the upper viewport of the larynx, his obsidian scales shimmering with a terrifying violet light. The Drake didn't land. He pounced, his massive claws shredding the Centurion into a mess of scrap metal and gore. "Gale," Jaxen whispered, his vision fading. The beast didn't look at him. He turned his nitrogen-blue eyes toward the remaining Centurions, his fur crackling with the raw energy of the planet. He wasn't just a Drake anymore. He was the physical manifestation of Krios Nine's defiance. On the central platform, Malachor let out a scream of rage. "Slay the beast! Protect the spire! The broadcast must proceed!" But the Centurions were no match for the ancient predator. Obsidian Gale moved with a speed and ferocity that defied their programming. He was a storm of teeth and fire, a force of nature that didn't follow the rules of the machine. Below the chaos, Thalia reached the console. Her fingers flew over the alien interface, her mind a bridge between the digital world of the hegemony and the biological world of the Drakes. She felt Malachor's presence in the system, a cold, jagged barrier of logic that tried to shut her out. "I won't let you," she whispered, her lavender skin glowing with a brilliant, blinding light. She didn't try to hack his firewalls. She didn't try to outcalculate him. She did the only thing a human would do. She gave herself over to the static. She opened her mind to the archive, to the billion voices of the past, and funneled them all into the resonance matrix. It wasn't a broadcast of data. It was a broadcast of life. The resonance crystal didn't shatter. It harmonized. The violent violet energy smoothed out into a steady, brilliant silver light that radiated from the spire in a massive, expanding wave. The light washed over the technicians, over the Centurions, and over Malachor. The Inquisitor screamed, his milky white eyes widening in terror as the raw, unfiltered history of his people flooded his neural link. He saw the faces of the children they had forgotten. He felt the pain of the worlds they had conquered. He felt the fear they had tried to erase. The machine couldn't handle the truth. Malachor's neural link exploded in a shower of sparks, his body collapsing onto the platform like a discarded puppet. The mesh in the larynx shattered, the cold mathematical silence replaced by the beautiful, messy noise of a billion souls. The silver light swept across Krios Nine, touching the Drakes in their habitats, the miners in their pits, and the soldiers in their barracks. It didn't kill them, it woke them up. It was a wake-up call 300 years in the making. Jaxen lay on the floor, his body broken, but his mind finally, blissfully quiet. He watched as Thalia stepped away from the console, her silver hair streaming behind her like a banner of hope. She looked at him, and for the first time, she wasn't trembling because she was afraid. She was trembling because she was overwhelmed by the beauty of the world. "We did it, Jaxen," she said, her voice a soft, melodic hum that vibrated in the silver light. "We woke them all up." Jaxen gave her a weak, bloody grin. "Told you, human thing is mostly just stubbornness." He closed his eyes, the warmth of the silver light wrapping around him like a blanket. He was tired, so incredibly tired. But as he listened to the distant, joyous howl of Obsidian Gale and the sound of Thalia's steady heartbeat, he knew that the fear was finally gone. He wasn't a ghost in the machine anymore. He was a man. And for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The larynx stood tall against the storm, its silver light a beacon of defiance in the dark. The hegemony was still out there, their fleets still circling the planet like vultures. But Krios Nine wasn't a prison anymore. It was a spark, and sparks had a way of turning into wildfires. Jaxen felt a hand on his arm, a warm, firm grip that pulled him back from the edge of the dark. He opened his eyes and saw Thalia looking down at him, her eyes filled with a love that no machine could ever calculate. "Stay with me, Jaxen Vane," she whispered. "The story isn't over yet." "I'm not going anywhere, Princess," he said, his voice a faint but steady rasp. "I still have to show you how to make a decent cup of coffee." They laughed, a small, fragile sound that echoed through the silence of the larynx. It was the sound of the future, and it was the most beautiful thing Jaxen had ever heard. The storm outside began to die down, the screaming wind fading into a soft, melodic whisper. The planet was at peace, for now. But as Jaxen looked up at the silver light of the spire, he knew that the real work was just beginning. They had given the people their memories back. Now they had to teach them how to live with them. It was a tall order for a scout and a princess. But as Jaxen felt the static in his head settle into a comfortable, rhythmic pulse, he knew they could handle it. After all, they had already survived the worst the universe could throw at them. The rest was just details. The silver radiance of the larynx did not simply fade. It dissolved into the atmosphere of Krios Nine like a slow-acting medicine entering a feverish bloodstream. In the minutes following the broadcast, a heavy, almost sacred silence settled over the volcanic spire. The screaming noise of the synaptic mesh, that constant, oppressive background hum that had defined Thalia's entire existence, was gone. For the first time in 28 years, the High Lady of the Hegemony was truly alone inside her own head. Jaxen Vane lay sprawled against the base of a power conduit, his chest heaving as he fought for every breath. His ribs were a shattered mess of pain, and every time his heart beat, it felt like a hot needle was being driven into his sternum. But the static in his mind had changed. It was no longer a jagged, chaotic storm. It had smoothed out into a rhythmic tidal pulse that seemed to sync with the very rotation of the planet. "Jaxen, stay with me," Thalia whispered, her voice cracking as she knelt beside him. She was using a piece of her golden ceremonial sash to stanch the bleeding from a deep gash on his temple. Her hands were shaking, her lavender skin pale and slick with sweat. Without the mesh to regulate her adrenaline, her body was experiencing a full-scale chemical rebellion. "I am not going anywhere, princess," Jaxen wheezed, his eyes fluttering open to meet her silver gaze. "Just having a little sit-down. My lungs are currently having a disagreement with my skeleton." Thalia let out a shaky, wet laugh. "You are an impossible man. You just took on a squad of centurions and saved 1 billion souls, and you're worried about a disagreement?" "I am a professional," Jaxen grunted, wincing as he tried to shift his weight. "Now give me the sit rep. Did it work? Is the machine dead?" Thalia looked up at the crystalline spire. The silver light had retreated into the heart of the stone, leaving it glowing with a soft, steady warmth. "Malakor's flatlined," she said, her voice hardening. His neural link overloaded when the archive hit the resonance crystal. His mind couldn't handle the individuality. "He is a shell, Jaxen. Just meat and circuitry." Jaxen nodded, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. "Good. One less gearhead in the universe. But we are not out of the woods yet. Malakor was just the local muscle. The Synaptic Union doesn't like losing assets. They'll be sending a cleanup crew, and they won't be looking to talk." He was right. Even as they spoke, the static in Jaxen's head began to pick up a new frequency. It was cold, distant, and massive. It was the sound of iron doors slamming shut across the stars. "The Union is coming," Jaxen said, his voice dropping to a serious rasp. "And they aren't sending scouts this time. I can feel the weight of a purge fleet in high orbit." Thalia stood up, her jaw setting in a line of defiance that Jaxen had come to recognize as her combat face. "Then we need to move. We can't stay in the larynx. It's a beacon. We need to get back to the lower levels, to the hangar bays." Jaxen looked at her, truly looking at her. She was covered in grime, blood, and the residue of a psychic explosion. Her royal status was a memory, her future a death sentence. And yet she stood there with more grace than he had ever seen in 1,000 hegemony galas. "You're terrified, aren't you?" Jaxen asked softly. Thalia didn't look away. "I have never felt so small in my entire life, Jaxen. The silence in my head, it's like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark. I keep waiting for the mesh to tell me what to do, how to feel, who to be, and there is nothing but me." "That is the secret, princess," Jaxen said, reaching out to take her hand. His grip was weak, but his fingers were steady. "That silence? That is freedom. It is the scariest thing in the universe because it means you're the one holding the compass, but it also means you're the one who gets to decide where to go." Thalia squeezed his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. "Then I choose to go down? I choose to fight." They began the descent, a slow and agonizing process. Jaxen was a dead weight, his body protesting every movement, but Thalia refused to leave him. She slung his arm over her shoulder, her smaller frame straining under the weight of his armor. Obsidian Gale followed them like a silent obsidian ghost, his nitrogen blue eyes scanning the shadows for any remaining threats. The station was a tomb. The technicians they passed were slumped over their consoles, their eyes wide and vacant. They weren't dead, but their minds were in a state of profound shock. The archive had given them back their memories, but it had also ripped away the only reality they had ever known. They were like children woken from a dream into a cold, dark room. It's going to take them years to process this, Thalia said as they passed a group of workers who were weeping quietly in a corner. If they survived the Union's arrival, we gave them a chance, Jaxen said. That is more than they had this morning. Survival is a full-time job, Princess. No one said it was going to be easy. They reached the secondary elevator, a massive industrial lift that dropped into the volcanic heart of the station. As the doors slid shut, the static in Jaxen's head suddenly spiked. "Duck!" he roared, shoving Thalia to the floor, just as a volley of plasma bolts hissed through the closing gap. A group of 3 remaining Centurions had emerged from a side corridor, their armor scorched, but their rifles still functional. They were operating on a primitive, pre-programmed combat loop, their synaptic links shattered, but their directives still clear. Eliminate all unauthorized life forms. "Scud brain machines!" Jaxen spat, pulling his kinetic pistol and firing a blind volley through the closing doors. The elevator began to drop, the lurching motion making Jaxen's head spin. He collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "We're losing time, Thalia. The Union is dropping pods. I can feel the heat signatures hitting the upper atmosphere." "How many?" Thalia asked, her hands hovering over the elevator's manual controls. "Dozens," Jaxen said. "Maybe hundreds. They are going to carpet bomb the larynx and then move in to reclaim the station. They want the resonance crystal, Thalia. They can't let that kind of tech fall into unoptimized hands." "Then we destroy it," Thalia said, her voice cold and certain. Jaxen looked at her in surprise. "That crystal is worth 10 star systems, Princess. It is the pinnacle of hegemony science. You want to turn it into slag?" "It is a leash, Jaxen," Thalia replied, her silver eyes glowing with a fierce light. "My people used it to build a golden cage. If the only way to be free is to burn the cage down, then I will be the one to light the fire." The elevator hit the bottom with a jarring thud. They emerged into the hangar bay, a cavernous space filled with rows of sleek, silver interceptors and heavy transport ships. Most of them were slave to the station's main computer, which was currently offline, making them useless heaps of metal. But in a far corner, hidden behind a stack of shipping crates, sat a battered, soot-stained vessel that looked like it had been held together by spit and stubbornness. It was a long-range scout ship, an old Pathfinder model that didn't have a single synaptic link in its entire hull. "The rusty needle," Jaxen whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "My ticket out of here." "It looks like a pile of scrap," Thalia said, eyeing the ship's pitted hull and exposed wiring. "She is a lady," Jaxen defended, leaning heavily on Thalia as they approached the boarding ramp. "She is purely mechanical. No mesh, no AI, no fancy subroutines, just old-fashioned fusion and manual flight controls. It's the only ship on this rock that Malachor couldn't track." "Can you fly it?" Thalia asked. Jaxen looked at his mangled ribs and his trembling hands. "On a good day, I am the best pilot in the sector. Today, I am probably going to fly us into a moon." "Then I will do it," Thalia said. Jaxen barked a laugh that turned into a cough. "You? Princess, you've never touched a manual stick in your life. You think flying is just thinking at a computer. This ship is heavy. It fights you. It has a personality, and mostly that personality is, I want to crash." "Then teach me," Thalia said, her voice unwavering. "I climbed the ladder, Jaxen. I felt the rungs. I can feel the ship." Jaxen looked at her, seeing the absolute terrifying resolve in her eyes. He realized then that she wasn't just learning to be human, she was excelling at it. The very thing that made humans dangerous, our refusal to accept the impossible, had taken root in her. "Fine," Jaxen grunted, limping toward the cockpit. "But if you scratch the paint, I'm docking it from your royal allowance." They scrambled into the cramped, grease-stained cockpit. Jaxen slumped into the co-pilot seat, his hands flying over a bank of physical switches and analog dials. The ship groaned to life. the familiar hum of the fusion reactor, a comforting vibration in the floorboards. "Okay, Princess," Jaxen panted, his vision blurring. "Listen to the engine. Don't look at the displays, they're mostly lying anyway. Feel the vibration in the seat. That's your connection. If the hum turns into a rattle, you're pushing too hard. If it turns into a whine, you're losing thrust." Thalia gripped the heavy dual-axis flight sticks, her knuckles turning white. "It's so heavy." "That's called mass," Jaxen said. "It's a real thing. Now ease the thrusters. We need to clear the hangar before the Union ships lock onto our heat signature." Thalia took a deep breath, her silver hair damp with sweat. She closed her eyes for a second, not to connect to the mesh, but to find the center of her own fear. She felt the ship, the raw, unpolished power of the engines. She felt Jaxen's presence beside her, a steady, battered beacon of survival. She pushed the sticks forward. The rusty needle roared as it lurched off the hangar floor, the old engines screaming in protest. They cleared the primary doors just as a massive Union dropship slammed into the volcanic slopes above them, the shock wave rattling the ship's teeth. "We're out!" Thalia shouted, her face lighting up with a fierce, terrified joy. "Not yet," Jaxen said, his eyes fixed on the long-range scanners. "We've got 3 interceptors, breaking formation. They're coming in hot." Thalia gripped the sticks harder. "What do I do?" "You fly," Jaxen said, his hand moving to the weapon controls. "And you don't look back. Courage, Thalia. Just keep taking the next step." The interceptors closed in, their pulse cannons lighting up the darkening sky of Krios Nine. The needle groaned as it dove into a narrow canyon, the jagged crystalline walls rushing past them in a blur of gray and white. Thalia was fighting the ship, her muscles screaming with the effort, but she didn't let go. She was no longer a node in a network. She was a pilot. She was a rebel. She was alive. And in the seat beside her, Jaxen Vane watched the Princess of the Stars become the savior of the world. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. The sky of Krios Nine was no longer white. It had turned a bruised, sickly violet, choked by the exhaust of 200 Union warships that now hung in the upper atmosphere like a swarm of metallic locusts. The gravity wells of the massive cruisers were distorting the clouds, creating localized hurricanes that whipped the crystalline snow into a frenzy. In the center of this nightmare, the Neural Reaper had arrived. It was a ship designed for one purpose, the total erasure of dissent. It was a 3-kilometer needle of black glass, pulsing with a low-frequency broadcast that made Jaxen's static feel like it was being sandpapered. The Reaper didn't fire beams, it fired signals. It sent out a global reset command, a massive psychic wave designed to overwrite the awakened minds of the population and slam them back into the silent obedience of the mesh. Jaxen felt the wave hit before the ship's sensors did. He let out a strangled cry, his hands clutching at his head as his mutation reacted to the intrusion. It was like a billion cold voices screaming, "Submit," directly into his cerebral cortex. "Jaxen!" Thalia screamed, her hands struggling to keep the rusty needle steady as the psychic feedback rattled the ship's manual controls. "They're rebooting." "The world," Jaxen wheezed, blood beginning to leak from his ears. "The Reaper. It's a broadcast hub. If they hit the resonance crystal with that signal, it's over. Every mind on this rock will be wiped clean." Thalia looked through the viewport at the black needle descending toward the larynx. The silver light of the spire was already beginning to flicker, turning a muddy, static gray as the Reaper's broadcast began to interfere with the archive's resonance. "Then we have to take out that ship," Thalia said. Jaxen looked at her as if she had suggested they punch the sun. "Thalia, that's a dreadnought-class vessel. We are in a 60-year-old scout ship that leaks fuel and has exactly 2 kinetic cannons. We can't even scratch their paint." "I don't need to scratch it," Thalia said, her voice unnervingly calm. "I just need to get us inside the shield perimeter." "Inside?" Jaxen coughed, a spray of red hitting his visor. "The shields on that thing will vaporize us before we get within a kilometer." "Not if we go through the exhaust ports," Thalia replied. "I know the schematics of the Reaper class, Jaxen. Every Union ship has a thermal venting cycle every 600 seconds to prevent synaptic overheating. For 5 seconds, the rear shielding drops to 10% to allow the discharge. Jaxen stared at her, the pain in his chest forgotten for a split second. You want to fly a manual scout ship into the exhaust port of a neural reaper while it's broadcasting a world-ending signal? Thalia looked at him, and for the first time, Jaxen saw no trace of the princess he had met in the snow. He saw a woman who had walked through the fire and found she liked the heat. I'm terrified, Jaxen, she said softly. My heart is beating so fast I think it might explode. My hands won't stop shaking, but I am not going to let them turn us back into ghosts. I would rather be space dust than a file save. Jaxen felt a surge of something that wasn't static and wasn't fear. It was a raw, primal pride. He reached out and flipped a series of switches on the weapons console, overriding the safety limiters on the Needle's engines. Fine, he grunted, a bloody grin spreading across his face. But if we die, I'm haunted by the fact that you had the better plan. Thalia yanked the sticks back, and the Needle roared, its engines glowing a dangerous, overclocked blue. They didn't fly toward the larynx. They flew straight up, aiming for the belly of the Black Needle. The Union interceptors were all around them now, their pulse fires stitching the air with lines of lethal light. Thalia dove, rolled, and spiraled, using the Needle's small size to dance through the gaps in their formation. She wasn't using a computer to calculate the trajectories. She was using her eyes, her hands, and the gut-wrenching sensation of the G-force. 500 meters, Jaxen shouted, his hands flying over the sensor array. Shields are still at 100%. Hold on, Thalia roared. The Reaper began its venting cycle. A massive plume of blue-white fire erupted from the rear of the ship, the heat so intense it melted the ice on the Needle's wings instantly. For a heartbeat, the dark glass of the Reaper's hull was exposed. Now! Thalia slammed the thrusters to maximum. The Needle groaned, every rivet in the hull screaming as it accelerated into the heart of the fire. They punched through the shield envelope just as it snapped back into place, the impact throwing Jaxen against the cockpit glass. We're in, Jaxen wheezed, looking back to see the shimmering blue wall of the shields closing behind them. We're inside the perimeter. They were flying through a narrow canyon of black glass and glowing conduits, the internal structure of the Reaper, a terrifying forest of technology. Thalia piloted the ship with a desperate, laser-focused intensity, weaving through the massive cooling fins and data towers. The broadcast core is at the center of the ship, Thalia said, her voice strained. If we can hit the cooling manifold for the psychic array, the whole system will backfire. It'll turn the Reaper into a localized EMP. And us? Jaxen asked. Thalia didn't answer. She didn't have to. They reached the central hub, a massive chamber filled with glowing violet liquid in a forest of neural rods that pulsed in time with the Reaper's broadcast. The air here was so thick with psychic energy that Jaxen could taste copper on his tongue. There! Jaxen pointed to a small shielded pipe that ran into the base of the array. That's the manifold. One shot should do it. Thalia lined up the ship, her finger hovering over the fire button. But as she prepared to take the shot, a shadow fell over the cockpit. A massive armored figure stood on a platform directly in front of them. It was a High Inquisitor, his skin a deeper shade of lavender, his eyes glowing with a cold, artificial white light. He wasn't using a weapon. He was using his mind. He raised a hand, and the Needle's engines sputtered and died. The ship hung in the air, held in place by a massive graviton grip. Lady Thalia, the Inquisitor's voice echoed directly into their minds, cold and devoid of all emotion. Your rebellion is a statistical anomaly. It will be corrected. Jaxen tried to reach for the manual override, but the Inquisitor's psychic grip was like a mountain on his chest. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. You think you can win? Jaxen wheezed, his eyes bulging. The Inquisitor turned his sightless gaze to Jaxen. You are the catalyst of this corruption, human. You represent the chaos that the Union was built to eliminate. You will be the first to be realigned. He began to squeeze. Jaxen felt his ribs finally give way, a white-hot agony exploding in his chest. His vision began to go dark, the static in his head fading into a dull, gray hum. Jaxen, Thalia cried, her own body pinned against the pilot's seat. In that moment of absolute darkness, Jaxen didn't think about survival. He didn't think about the mission or the planet. He thought about the climb. He thought about the fear. He thought about the woman beside him who had chosen to be human in a universe that wanted her to be a machine. Transformation isn't about being perfect, Jaxen thought, his consciousness fading. It's about being brave enough to break. With a final, desperate burst of will, Jaxen reached deep into the core of his mutation. He didn't project the static this time. He didn't use it as a weapon. He used it as a bridge. He funneled all his pain, all his fear, and all his stubborn, messy humanity into the one thing that was still connected to the ship, the manual trigger. He didn't move his hand. He moved the world. The static jumped the gap between his mind and the ship's wiring, a raw, unpolished spark of human will that bypassed all of the Inquisitor's psychic shields. The needle's kinetic cannons roared. The slugs hit the manifold with the force of a falling moon. The pipe shattered. A geyser of super-cooled liquid sprang across the psychic array. The reaction was instantaneous. The violet liquid turned white, then blue, then exploded in a blinding wave of static. The Inquisitor let out a scream of pure digital agony as his neural link was vaporized. The graviton grip shattered, and the needle fell toward the floor of the chamber. Thalia grabbed the sticks, her hands moving with a speed that was no longer human or machine. It was something new. She caught the ship just meters from the floor and slammed the thrusters toward the exit. "We have to get out of here," she roared. "The ship is going critical." Jaxen lay slumped in his seat, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed. He heard the roar of the explosion behind them, the sound of the Reaper tearing itself apart as the EMP wave washed through its black glass hull. He heard the screams of the interceptors as their synaptic links were fried. He felt the needle punch back through the shields and out into the violet sky of Krios Nine. The air was clear now, the psychic broadcast silenced. The silver light of the larynx was returning, stronger and brighter than before. "Thalia," Jaxen whispered. "I'm here, Jaxen," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I've got you. Just stay with me." I told you," Jaxen wheezed, a faint smile touching his lips. "I don't scare easy." He let the darkness take him then, not because he was defeated, but because he was finished. He had fought the machine, he had saved the princess, and he had proven that even in a galaxy of billions, a single, messy, terrified human could still change the script. Thalia piloted the ship toward the Shimmer Peaks, the silver light of the world guiding her home. She looked at the man beside her, at his broken body and his quiet, stubborn face, and she knew that her journey was just beginning. She wasn't a high lady, she wasn't a prisoner, she was Thalia. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't trembling because she was afraid of the dark. She was trembling because she was looking at the dawn. The rusty needle landed softly in a valley of obsidian sand, far from the burning ruins of the fortress. As the engines cooled and the silence of the world returned, Thalia leaned over and kissed Jaxen's forehead. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing me the rungs." Outside, the first rays of the true sun began to break through the violet clouds, illuminating the jagged peaks of Krios Nine. The Union fleet was retreating, their command links in shambles, their certainty shaken. The revolution had begun, and it was being led by a woman who knew the weight of a ladder and a man who wasn't afraid to break. The silence that followed the explosion of the Neural Reaper was not the empty, mathematical vacuum of the synaptic mesh. It was a heavy, living thing, thick with the scent of ozone and the distant, rhythmic crackle of secondary fires burning within the black glass wreckage. The rusty needle sat slumped in the obsidian valley, its hull pinging as the metal cooled in the sub-zero air of Krios Nine. Inside the cramped cockpit, the only light came from the flickering amber of the emergency backups and the soft, lavender luminescence of Thalia's skin. Jaxen Vane was dying, or at least it felt like his soul was being pulled through a very narrow, very sharp aperture. His breathing was a wet, ragged rasp that echoed too loudly in the quiet cabin. Every time his heart pumped, a fresh wave of white-hot agony flared from his shattered ribs, threatening to pull him back into the gray abyss of unconsciousness. But more than the physical trauma, it was the static that was hollowed out. The mutation that had been his constant, buzzing companion for 34 years felt like a burnout fuse. The silence in his head was terrifying. Jaxen, stay with me. You hear me? Don't you dare flatline now, Thalia whispered, her voice cracking with a raw, unpolished grief. She was kneeling in the narrow aisle, her hands frantically rummaging through a battered emergency medical kit. She had discarded her golden regal sash long ago, using it to wrap a jagged wound in Jaxen's side. Without the mesh to guide her, without 1,000 medical subroutines telling her exactly which artery to clamp, she was just a woman with blood on her hands and a heart that felt like it was being squeezed by a graviton vise. I'm still on the clock, Princess, Jaxen wheezed, his eyes fluttering open. A thin trickle of crimson ran from the corner of his mouth. Just checking the inside of my eyelids for holes. Stop talking, you scud-brained idiot, she snapped, though her eyes were shimmering with tears. She pulled out a manual suture stapler, a primitive tool used by miners, and looked at it with a mixture of horror and determination. I have to close the abdominal laceration. The nanites aren't responding. The EMP fried the station's local medical grid. Jaxen let out a weak, dry chuckle that ended in a wince. No nanites, no mesh, just you and a stapler. Welcome to the frontier, Your Highness. It's a real riot. Thalia didn't answer. She took a deep breath, her chest heaving as she fought back the overwhelming urge to scream. The shivers were back, vibrating through her limbs with a violence she couldn't suppress. It was fear, pure, unfiltered, and terrifying. In the hegemony, fear was a signal to be optimized. Here it was a physical weight that made the stapler feel like it weighed 10 kilograms. I'm afraid, Jaxen, she whispered, her forehead resting against his armored shoulder for a fleeting second. I can't feel the collective. I can't feel the certainty. What if I fail? What if I break you? Jaxen reached out a trembling, blood-stained hand and rested it on top of hers. His skin was cold, but his grip was surprisingly firm. Then you break me. That's the deal. You act, even when your hands won't stop shaking. That's the only way we ever get anywhere. Thalia looked at him, seeing the absolute trust in his dark eyes, and something inside her finally clicked into place. She wasn't a node in a network. She wasn't an administrator of data. She was a living being responsible for another. She steadied her hands, aligned the stapler, and began to work. Outside, the world was waking up in a way it hadn't in 300 years. Across the crystalline flats, thousands of miners and station workers were stumbling out of their habitats, their hands clutching at their heads as the fog of the synaptic mesh lifted. They were experiencing the Great Awakening, and it was not a peaceful process. For many, the sudden influx of individual memory and raw emotion was too much to bear. Near the wreckage of the primary airlock, a group of workers had gathered around a slumped Centurion. The armored giant was silent, its internal systems fried by the EMP, its visor dark. A few hours ago, these men would have trembled at its shadow. Now they looked at it with a mixture of curiosity and a budding, dangerous anger. It's just metal, one of the miners muttered, his voice raspy from years of breathing silicate dust. He's just a man in a can. All this time, we were afraid of a suit of armor. Beside him, an older woman with skin the color of parched earth sat on a crate, weeping quietly into her hands. I remember my daughter, she whispered, her voice trembling. I remember her face. They told me she was a redundant file. They told me she never existed. But I remember her name. Her name was Alara. The sentiment was rippling through the crowd like a wildfire. It wasn't just data returning. It was the humanistic weight of their own lives. They were realizing that their suffering hadn't been a statistical necessity, but a choice made by those who viewed them as units of production. The fear was still there, but it was being rapidly replaced by a profound sense of loss, and beneath that, a cold, hard resolve to never be silenced again. High above the valley, Obsidian Gale stood on a jagged ridge of ice, his massive form silhouetted against the bruised violet sky. He let out a long, resonant howl that echoed through the shimmer peaks, a sound that carried the weight of 1 billion preserved memories. He was no longer just an archive, he was a sentinel. He watched the Union purge fleet as it maintained its distance in high orbit, their sensors likely blinded by the lingering electromagnetic interference from the Reaper's destruction. The beast turned its nitrogen-blue eyes toward the valley, sensing the two small heartbeats inside the rusty needle. He could feel the static in Jaxen's mind struggling to reform, and he could feel the raw, blazing light of Thalia's burgeoning individuality. He didn't move to help them. He knew that the most important part of their journey was the part they had to walk alone. Back inside the ship, Thalia had finished the last of the staples. She slumped back against the co-pilot's seat, her lavender bodysuit stained with Jaxen's blood, her silver hair tangled and dull. She looked at him, her chest heaving with exhaustion. "You're stable," she panted. "For now. I've bypassed the primary bleed. But you need real surgery, Jaxen. You need a facility that hasn't been hit by an EMP." Jaxen was breathing more easily now, though his face was still the color of wet ash. "There's a smuggler's moon, 3 light years, toward the rift, the empty pocket, no union, no mesh, just a lot of bad people who are very good at keeping secrets." 3 light years, Thalia repeated, looking at the flickering navigation console. "In this ship, with these engines, we'll be lucky if we make it past the second moon." "She's got heart, Princess," Jaxen said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual grit. "Just like you. We just have to take the next step." Thalia looked through the viewport at the rising sun. The light was hitting the crystalline mountains, turning them into a forest of diamonds. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and it terrified her to her core. Every kilometer they flew would be a gamble. Every decision she made could be their last. She reached out and gripped the flight sticks, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt the shivers returning, the cold, creeping dread of the unknown. But then she looked at Jaxen, saw the scars on his face and the stubborn tilt of his jaw, and she realized that she didn't want to be anywhere else. "Strap in, human," she said, her voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous purr. "We're going to the empty pocket, and if the Union tries to stop us, I'll show them exactly what happens when you try to realign a woman who's finally found her voice." Jaxen grinned, a bloody, beautiful expression of pure defiance. "That's my princess. Let's bug out." The Rusty Needle's engines roared, a desperate mechanical scream that echoed across the Obsidian Valley. The ship lurched off the ground, shedding ice and scrap metal as it clawed its way toward the violet sky. Below them, the people of Krios Nine looked up, watching the lone spark of light as it defied the darkness of the hegemony. They were still afraid, still broken, and still lost. But as the silver light of the larynx continued to pulse in the distance, they knew that they weren't alone. The era of the machine was over. The era of the individual had begun, and it was going to be a hell of a lot noisier than anyone had ever imagined. 12 hours had passed since the Needle had jumped into the chaotic slipstream of the Rift territories. The ship was a symphony of groans and rattles, every bulkhead protesting the sheer strain of the journey. Jaxen was drifting in and out of a feverish sleep, his mind a kaleidoscope of static and half-remembered dreams of the Veloni siege. But every time he woke, he saw the same thing. Thalia, her hands steady on the manual controls, her silver eyes fixed on the swirling nebula of the rift. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. She had become the living soul of the ship, navigating through the gravimetric anomalies and radiation clouds with a raw, instinctual skill that she hadn't known she possessed. Without the mesh to guide her, she was learning to fly by the seat of her pants, feeling the vibration of the engines through the soles of her feet and the tension of the hull in the marrow of her bones. "We're approaching the perimeter of the empty pocket," Thalia whispered, her voice raspy from hours of silence. "I can see the beacon. It's a mess, Jaxen. There are dozens of derelict stations and scrap fields. It looks like a graveyard." Jaxen forced his eyes open, his vision blurry and tinged with yellow. "It's a paradise, Princess. No rules, no consensus. Just people. Beautiful, messy people." He tried to sit up, but a sharp spike of pain in his side reminded him of the 24 staples holding his gut together. He slumped back, his gaze falling on his own hands. They were calloused, scarred, and stained with grease. For years, he had viewed his static as a curse, a defect that made him an outcast in a galaxy of perfect connections. But as he watched Thalia navigate the ship, he realized that the static was just a precursor to what she was experiencing now. It was the noise of freedom. "I used to hate it," Jaxen said, his voice a faint but steady rasp. "The buzzing, the noise. I thought it was a broken wire in my head. I thought it meant I was less than the people who could connect." Thalia glanced at him, her expression soft in the amber glow of the cockpit. "And now?" "Now I think it was the only real thing about me," Jaxen replied. "The mesh. It's like a lullaby that never ends. It makes you feel safe, but it makes you forget that you're dreaming." The static. It's the alarm clock. It's the thing that reminds you that you're awake, even when the world is screaming at you to go back to sleep. He looked out at the rift, at the swirling clouds of gas in the distant cold stars. He thought about the climb in the volcano, the weight of the ladder, and the raw, stinging pain of the ice. He thought about the fear that had been his constant companion since he had first met Thalia in the snow. "I spent my whole life being afraid of the shivers," Jaxen mused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I thought courage was about being a wall, something that didn't move, something that didn't feel. But look at you. You're shaking like a leaf, and you're flying a ship through a gravity storm. You're terrified, and you're still doing it. That's the most human thing I've ever seen, Your Highness." Thalia let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the flight sticks. "I don't think I can ever go back, not just to the hegemony, but to the person I was. That woman died in the larynx. She was a ghost. This is exhausting, Jaxen. It hurts, it's loud, and I don't know what's going to happen 10 minutes from now." "That's the secret," Jaxen said, his eyes closing as the exhaustion finally began to win. "No one does. We just keep taking the next step." The rusty needle entered the docking bay of the empty pocket with a jarring thud that nearly shook the ship apart. The hangar was a chaotic, dimly lit cavern filled with the smell of cheap fuel, recycled air, and the loud, boisterous voices of 100 different species. It was a sensory overload, a cacophony of life that would have driven a hegemony royal into a catatonic state within seconds. Thalia stood up from the pilot's seat, her legs wobbling as she faced the airlock. She looked at Jaxen, who was being loaded onto a hovering stretcher by a pair of rough-looking medical droids with mismatched limbs and rusted chassis. "I'll find a way to pay for the surgery," Thalia told him. Her voice regained its regal authority, but this time it was tempered with a fierce, protective love. "I still have a few golden circuits left in this suit, and if that's not enough, I'll find work. I'm a quick study." Jaxen gave her a weak, lopsided grin as the droids began to pull him toward the medical wing. "Just don't scratch the paint on the ship, Princess. I'm sentimental." As the airlock doors cycled open and the noise of the empty pocket flooded the ship, Thalia took a final look at the cockpit. She saw the blood on the floor, the scorched panels, and the flickering navigation screen. She saw the record of their journey, a jagged, impossible line across the stars. She stepped out onto the metal grating of the docking bay, her head held high, her silver eyes scanning the crowd. She felt the shivers, the cold, creeping dread of being a stranger in a strange land. But she didn't try to suppress it. She didn't try to optimize it. She simply accepted it as a part of her, a companion on the long road ahead. "I spent 28 years believing that the universe was a series of equations to be solved, a grand data set where every life was a variable, and every death was an outlier to be smoothed over by the consensus of the mesh. I thought that to be perfect was to be silent, to have no doubt, no fear, and no self. But as I stand here in the grimy, beautiful chaos of the empty pocket, I realize that I was never perfect. I was just empty. Jaxen showed me the rungs of a ladder I didn't even know existed. He showed me that the shivers aren't a sign of weakness, but a sign of presence. To be human, or whatever it is I am becoming, is to live in the gap between the fear and the action. It is the choice to move when the air is biting and the mountain is tall. It is the realization that the static isn't a defect, but the very sound of a soul trying to find its own frequency. I look at the scars on my hands, the bruises on my skin, and the exhaustion in my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I don't see a file that needs to be realigned. I see a story that is finally being written. I am no longer a high lady of the synaptic hegemony. I am a woman who climbed a volcano, who flew through a fire, and who found a man worth bleeding for. I am afraid and I am tired, and I have absolutely no idea what tomorrow holds. And for the first time, that is exactly how I want to feel. Because if I am not afraid, how will I ever know when I'm being brave? The crowd in the docking bay was a sea of unfamiliar faces, rough miners, scarred mercenaries, and wide-eyed refugees. They looked at Thalia with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, their gazes lingering on her silver hair and her glowing skin. She was an anomaly, a fragment of an empire that most of them hated or feared. But she didn't look away. She didn't hide behind a mask of imperial disdain. She walked into the crowd, her hand resting on the hilt of the kinetic pistol she had taken from Jaxen's ship. She was a variable in their world now, a glitch in their reality. And as she began to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the station, looking for the medical wing, she felt a strange, quiet sense of belonging. She thought about the billions of souls back on Krios Nine, the people who were waking up to the same noise and the same fear. She wondered if they were looking at their own hands, seeing the bruises and the scars, and realizing that they were finally real. She wondered if they were standing in their own obsidian valleys, looking at the sunrise and feeling the shivers. I wonder, when you look at the challenges in your own life, the mountains that seem too high to climb, the storms that seem too loud to face, do you wait for the fear to go away before you take that first step? Or have you realized, as I have, that the fear is not the wall, but the very rungs of the ladder that will carry you home? Thalia stopped in front of a heavy, rusted door, marked with a fading red cross. She took a deep breath, her hands still trembling, her heart still hammering in her chest. She looked at the door, then back at the ship that had brought them here. She reached out and pushed the door open, stepping into the dim, noisy light of the clinic. She wasn't trembling because she was afraid of what lay inside. She was trembling because she was ready to face it. Behind her, the stars of the rift continued to swirl in their chaotic, beautiful dance. A billion points of light in a universe that was suddenly, gloriously, no longer silent. Thalia walked through the doorway, her boots clicking softly on the metal floor, leaving the shadows of the past behind her as she stepped into the messy, unpredictable light of the future.